Hello everyone, welcome to this panel. We're going to be talking about representation of LGBT teens, but more specifically the narratives that happen after the coming out, which is sort of, I guess, the formative experience that most people chuck in when they're telling stories about queer teens. So I have these wonderful people on this panel. We have Ben-Hamida, we have Matisse, Fletcher, Lauren James and Alice Oseman, and we are going to let them introduce themselves. And when you introduce yourselves, please give us your pronouns, and then also tell us a coming out story as a nice little icebreaker that you enjoyed or that you thought was interesting, whether from, books, film, TV, etc. I should also point out my name is Rowan, and she, her pronouns.
Okay, so I'm Na, and my pronouns are she, her, and one of my favourite coming out stories is a film called Fourth Man Out, which is amazing and is on Netflix, so check it out. It's basically about this group of four lads, and one of them is gay, and he wrestles with the thought of coming out to his friends, so rather than his family. But it's really wholesome and pure, and he gets a little boyfriend, and it's sort of a coming out later in life. He's in his late 20s, which I think is quite rare to see, and it's really positive and uplifting, and shows that even your straight friends can be supportive, which is, I think, a really nice thing to see. So that's my favourite coming out story.
So hi, I'm Matisse, she, her pronouns, please, and I had to rack my brain a little bit for it, and honestly, it's not a piece of fiction. It's from the latest season of Queer Eye, when one of the, what do they call them? What's their name for them? I can't remember.
Heroes.
The heroes. One of the heroes came out to, I believe, his stepmother, and I bawled. But, who doesn't bawl at, every single episode of that? But it was just really sweet, and I'm glad that they, discussed that, and it was positive, but it was real, and he was scared, and, to kind of go through that journey, and he wasn't a teen, he was older, but to kind of live that out later in life was really powerful to me. So
I'm Lauren James. I'm a YA author, so I write books for teenagers, and a lot of my books have LGBT representation. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to say Alice's Heartstopper has one of the best coming out scenes. It's a webcomic that is soon to be published, and it's just really sweet and loving when it comes out to his mum. So, yeah.
Yay. Hi, I'm Alice Oseman. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also a YA author. I'm the author of 3 young adult novels and the creator of a webcomic, Heartstopper. I think one of my favourite coming out stories is a book series called Openly Straight by Bill Konigsberg. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, it's good.
And particularly the second book, which focuses on the love interest from the first book. And it's about this boy, he's trying to decide whether he's straight or bisexual, and he doesn't know, and he really struggles with the labels. And the kind of journey of the book is him finding peace in not wanting to label himself and sort of accepting that he's questioning, and he doesn't have to come out as anything right now. And I've never seen a coming out book about that, so that's my favourite.
Amazing. I'm going to say before we start real quick, trigger warning wise, stuff might come up, like the nature of this, we're discussing various different stories, so if anyone needs to take a moment to step out or just leave entirely, including the panel, totally fine, no one's going to be judging, it's all good. Look after yourselves, and we'll also have some questions at the end, so if you have any questions, be thinking and we'll come to you. So the first question I guess I want to talk about is a nice intro question for this session. Do we still need coming out stories? And what we want to do is kind of start with specifically because of your work in research. Do you feel like, your research involves a relationship between representation of fandom and real life people. Do you see a need for it kind of from that sociological or political level as well?
Absolutely. So my research is all about how minorities or marginalised communities use fandom essentially, but also any sort of creative outlet to make a commentary, even if that's not your first intention at the time of creating and putting something out there. That's its end result, one of its end results. And I think coming out stories are really powerful. I've talked in some of the panels about the power of the community and how being able to see yourself represented or see that you're going through something similar to someone else can give you a lot of guidance, can give you a lot of hope, that you're not the only one going through it, especially because the period before coming out, coming out it's not just a one-time thing, but the period before every time, you're always sort of, it's very lonely, or it can be. So I think having those stories there and available is really, really important, and everyone's story is not the same, so you get to see a lot of sort of like a spectrum of different coming out stories, and how people went about it, or how people dealt with the aftermath, because they vary as well. But I think we also have a lot more to go in regards to coming out stories, which we're going to touch upon, but like making them less sort of one-dimensional, or like just sort of, you come out once to everyone in your whole entire life and that's it. I've had to come out to people, like the same person, like at least 10 times until they got it. So it's just sort of like understanding that's more of a process than just like an event. And I think that's something that we should probably be seeing more of.
I want to, in that case, we're open to the rest of the panel in terms of talking about either of those points, what's important about coming out stories, but also what you feel is missing. If there's any specific experiences that you feel like in what we've done so far, before we move on from them, is there anything we still need to do with them?
Do you want to go? Yeah, I'll go. I was just thinking, like, it's easy for people like us who are very like immersed in the queer community, particularly online, and in like the book community as well, to think, oh, there have been so many coming out stories, like, why do we need any more? Like, there's been so many, they're all out there. But I feel like there's always going to be people who need those stories, and they're growing up and like they're finding these stories for the first time. So I honestly don't think there's ever going to be a time when we need to stop writing these stories.
I agree, and I think looking back on when I was a teenager and I was looking through my library, and like any book that looked like it might have LGBT content, I was taking it out, and all of the coming out narratives always had bad reactions. They weren't treated nicely, and I think that we are seeing a lot of coming out narratives, but we're now seeing more positive ones, like Simon James Green, his books especially. They're just like the perfect rom-com, and that's the kind of thing that I think we still need in terms of coming out narratives. As a writer, is I want to see positive, fun things, as well as like teaching teenagers how to prepare themselves for if it goes really badly wrong. We want people to enjoy it and make it feel like a positive thing.
It can also be a tool for parents as well to like see coming out stories, sometimes laid out like so simply and like positively or negatively, but told in a very like succinct and like reaction, get over it, you love your kid, whatever. And so outside of the narrative that is provided to queer people, it's great when you can see parents also see it, and then the whole spectrum of reactions as well, because then they reflect on themselves. How would I feel? Because every parent thinks it generally, I think, when they watch coming out stories as well, because you have the person watching it feeling a certain way, and then you have the parents watching it and feeling a certain way and going through that own question themselves, and like they can use that as a tool or inspiration as well, for sure.
Has anyone seen One Day at a Time?
Yes.
So like as soon as you said that, I was like, oh man. So for those who haven't seen it, I mean, it's not really a spoiler because it's all over the internet. There is a gay teenage daughter, and when she comes out, her mum is super supportive to her. She's like, this is incredible. But then when she's away from her daughter, she has a real difficult time dealing with it. And it's the first time I've seen that real nuance of, I'm going to be supportive in front of my daughter and like tell her I love her and stuff, but I still have to deal with the issues that I have, the religious and cultural issues, but also just the idea of I had a life that I thought my daughter was leading, and that's gone now, and I'm sort of like weirdly grieving for it. Yeah, I think it's very looking at the stories around the coming out and those things is interesting as well. So this, I guess, is about the beyond the coming out. So we will move on now to what different topics there are to talk about in terms of queer experiences beyond the coming out story. And I want to first go to Matisse, because of your work with young people in real life. Have you seen stuff from their lives and what they're going through that you feel like has really been missing from representation?
So I am speaking from a Seattle perspective. So I worked a lot with queer youth, and I did peer-to-peer outreach and education around drug and alcohol harm reduction and STI and HIV prevention education. And so what I saw a lot of was kind of, I mean, there's a huge unspoken or untold story of queer youth, particularly in urban settings, because at least in the States, queer youth count for a sickening amount of street youth. And the average age to become homeless is actually 12 years old. And that's around the average age that kids start realizing their sexuality, and there's definitely a tie between these two things. And so I've seen a lot of homeless teen queer topics in documentaries or in very small productions, but not really prevalent anywhere else. And granted, homelessness is underrepresented and hugely and grossly stereotyped in every form of media, so seeing that in general, but a lot of queer teens suffer homelessness, but not in necessarily the traditional way. They couch surf, they have jobs, they stay with friends, or sex work is also a place where queer teens, again, Seattle perspective, kind of fall back on as well, and then also kind of shooting off of that activism. Most youth activists are queer or some kind of underrepresented group, and so seeing those stories and the empowerment that goes along with it, that could loosely be tied to coming out, because you come out to your parents, they disown you, you're homeless or whatever. It all ties loosely together, but just to have those narratives told, because we don't actually see those narratives told in any form of media, whether it's heteronormative lens or otherwise. So that, my perspective on that feeds into those topics for sure.
I just have a recommendation for that, actually. So there's this anthology coming out called Proud, which is about by UK YA authors, and they're all telling short stories about LGBT teens. It's coming out, I believe, in March, springtime. Yeah. And one of the stories is by Moira Fowley-Doyle, and it's about a teenager activist working for marriage equality in Ireland, and it's really good.
So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Another rec on that. Do you know what? We're just going to keep recking, because I feel like that's what we need as well, like people like sharing and getting to know these stories. Has anyone seen Pose, the TV show that I definitely didn't see illegally? I feel fine about it because it's literally not available in the UK for any kind of thing. And I was like, do you know what? When it is, I'm buying the DVD, I'm supporting it, I'm doing everything. It's all about the ballroom scene, so specifically it's like black and brown queer youth and trans youth. It's got like the 4 leads who are queer, like a trans women of colour. It's unbelievable, and they do have storylines around LGBT homelessness and drug abuse and activism and sex work and like all of the stuff that I feel like is so underrepresented in like one show in an incredible way. So Pose, if you haven't seen it. So could anyone else in the panel want to chime in with ideas around like what you haven't seen in the narratives beyond coming out, or even other experiences that queer people go through that you feel like is not really been talked about or not enough?
For me, I was going to suggest like queer friendship. So in my second novel, Radio Silence, the sort of central relationship is a friendship between the protagonist, who's a bisexual girl, and like the other character, who is a asexual guy. And people were, like, the reaction to this book, people were so excited that I was showing this friendship between these 2 queer teens, and it wasn't romantic at all. And it got me thinking, like, there's hardly any queer YA books focusing on friendship. I think, I can't even think of one. Can you think of any? It's weird. I wish there were more, to be honest. So, yeah, that's something that I enjoyed writing about in Radio Silence, and I definitely want to write again, because it's important to have that support network of friends. And often I think that's more common in real life, having a queer friendship group rather than a significant other.
I agree, and also sort of LGBT people of more ages, not just teenagers coming out for the first time. I want more fiction to have younger LGBT characters. I know that I knew I was bisexual when I was very young. Older sort of grandparents who are in gay relationships. I feel like there's no examples of where you're going to be in the rest of your life. There's no sort of role models to look up to, and I think that's something that's really important for, like, when you work out you're gay, what comes next? Like, when you come out, that's not the end of your life. Like, there's more experiences to have, kind of thing. You don't really see that represented as much.
I have 2, I think. One is like coming out as a single person. So a lot of our coming out narratives relate to one person falling in love, realizing that they're gay or bi or queer, and then coming out because of that, and that's because they fall in love with someone and they have a relationship. Whereas like a lot of the time you come out because you want to. It feels like it's the right time. It's not because someone else is in your life that makes you feel like, if I want to pursue this, I have to let everybody know who I am. And then the second one I think that I would really like, which is kind of the opposite of what I've just said, is after coming out, introducing people to your future partners. You know, it's sort of like coming out again in a way, because people get used to the idea of you being somewhere on the queer spectrum, but then they have to like see it for reals, and that has a different reaction sometimes, and it's something that especially young queer people should like be prepared for, because it's not something that you think about. You think, I've done the biggest hurdle, but actually there's always so many more, not always negative, sometimes it's very, very positive, but I think that's something that could be explored as well, which is introducing someone to your new partner.
Amazing. Get that narrative in there. Someone write it. Someone write about it.
Oh, congratulations. Oh, wow.
But it was quite difficult coming out as an old person, and I had an 11-year-old child. No, you're 11 when I came out. Sorry. Answered me. My iPhone answered me.
Siri.
Oh, Siri.
So I feel like there's a discussion that happens where there's this kind of diametrically opposed thing of the coming out story, which is all about sexuality, and like we shouldn't do stories which are so focused on sexuality. It should just be a thing. Like, why do we need labels? Like, duh. And then you have the other side of it, which is like, sexuality has nothing to do with this story. In fact, it's so much nothing that it's not really mentioned, but they definitely are gay, we promise. And like, there's like those very split like extremes. And so a lot of the queer specific experiences we've been talking about are in that element of like, actually sexuality is like included in there. How do you feel about the other side of, you know, queer bent remakes, for example, like changing the genders of some stuff to kind of tell stories that really have nothing to do with sexuality in their original guise, and then kind of inserting it in like a subtle way? Do you think, like, what are your opinions, I guess, on like, those relationships between those different kinds of like that dichotomy?
I guess what immediately comes to mind for me is Doctor Who, especially now there's a female doctor, how they're going to handle the relationships that he was in now, whether they're going to bring River Song or any of those characters back. I think that's going to be really interesting, and I'm very intrigued to see how they deal with that. I've got my fingers crossed that they do something amazing.
Do we think they will?
They've been doing really well so far. It seems like they've got a good team, but we'll see.
Sweet. Just thought I'd give everyone some time. So my next question, we've kind of talked about a little bit about like why coming out is important and what else we could do with it, but I want to talk about why you would deliberately not show coming out. Throwing to Alice. So Alice has one of my favourite books. It's real good. I Was Born for This, which has a main character who is trans and gay, but like has already very much come out at the beginning of the book. That's not a thing. That's all the rest of the drama is totally unrelated to that. Why was that decision something that you made?
It's not going to sound very like intelligent, but honestly, I just did it because I could. Like, I have in radio science, I wrote a lot of queer characters, and I wanted to continue that in my third book, and I just got to the point where I was like, why would I not have a queer protagonist? Why could he not be trans? Why not? And I think for me, feeling by that point after my second book that I was in a position of power, I had quite a decent audience, a lot of LGBT teens were reading my books, and I just thought I had the chance to do this. Why would I not? And I didn't feel like, I had the idea for the book already, and it wasn't about coming out, so that never really kind of played into my thoughts. It just happened, and I keep saying why not, but that is like the main reason why I did it. Like, it's important, and I had the chance to, so I just did.
Because I think it's interesting because I mean, like, not a spoiler in any way, but the character's in like a massively famous boy band, and so I feel like it's one of those things that other people might have looked at that and been like, oh, well, the drama is clearly that he's in a boy band and maybe could get blackmailed with gossip and blah blah, and someone finds out and it's da da da. Like, it feels like that. Like, there's sort of drama that's inherent in coming out stories because you have the idea of stories being your internal conflict and the external conflict should be linked somehow, and coming out is the ultimate version of that because you have your own internal issues and then externally you're having to tell people. So it was just like I think a really interesting choice to say this is something that you're gonna stay away from.
Yeah, to add to that, I think it's important to show queer characters having problems in their lives that are not related to being queer, because that's realistic. There are, the character I'm talking about, Jimmy, he has a severe anxiety disorder, and that is quite a big focus of the book, like how that plays into him being so famous and how he's dealing with his life of having no privacy and constantly having to do shows. So, these, I mean, I suppose that's not a super relatable problem. But I think the point is, like, queer people are, being queer is a big, important part of their lives, but there are other things too, and they're worth writing about as well.
I mean, I guess jumping off from the idea, like, we opened with good coming out stories. Do you think that there's a bad way of doing coming out stories? Is that possible, or is it just they're all different? Oh, we do. Do you know what? Yes, I feel like the ultimate terrible bury your gays trope is the ultimate terrible way of coming out. That is actually very much an extreme.
Yeah. That is the worst. Can I take this?
Yeah, go for it. Anyone.
One of my worst and biggest pet peeves, and I'm so bitter about it, is always like the forced coming out. Like, someone finds out by accident when they're not ready and blackmails you until you're forced to come out, or some horrible chain of events forces you to come out, and I just think it's so traumatic, because coming out should be a choice, and it will be a choice that you do again and again and again over the course of your life. And I just, every time I watch it, it just makes me so uncomfortable, because that was my biggest fear growing up, was that someone was going to blackmail me, someone was going to find out, someone was just going to know and like make horrible hints in front of everyone when I wasn't prepared, or like hadn't even been ready to accept it myself. And I think that's probably, like, I hate it. I love Simon, by the way, but that trope happens in that film, and I was an anxious mess throughout the whole thing, because I just think it's an awful thing to have happen. And it does happen, but I think that when you're creating media, especially when you're trying to create a content that's safe, you have to be careful about how your narratives affect people. And if you're going to have a forced coming out story, God, make the fucker who forces, who forces them to come out or blackmails them, like, punish them at the end. It's a horrible thing to do. So I think that's something I really hate, that in coming out stories, is when it's not the queer person's choice to do so. Like, that's.
And in Love, Simon as well, his friends like blame him, like they don't understand why he did it, and I feel like,
and they get so annoyed, like, why didn't you tell me, or why did you tell this person and not me? And it's like, it's just so horrible. Yeah. Like, it's I love that film, but it has its things.
Anyone else got any bad coming out or coming out stuff that you're like not that into, or that you've seen played out too many times?
Like, in YA books, there's so many that have the narrative of, like, the character comes out and then they immediately get, like, violently attacked by, like, bullies, like, physically assaulted. I've read that so many times, and it's just, I just don't want to see any more of that. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, bullies are definitely a big thing in coming out stories.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's, like, realistic, but it's just, I see it over and over again, and I'd like to see more positive ones, to be honest.
Do you think that there's more of an obligation, such a tough word, but to show reality or to show positivity? Like, what's that relationship like?
So I have not written a coming out book. All of my books are about LGBT teenagers who've already come out and they're just having adventures, basically. So The Last Beginning has a gay protagonist and she's already come out, and the story is about her like travelling through time to find her missing parents, and this girl comes from the future and meets her along the way and they go on adventures. And it's not at all about her being a lesbian. And I did that because I wanted to read a fun story about a gay teenage girl, and I never had that when I was growing up, about showing that like Harry Potter could be gay, and like the fact that you're gay doesn't mean you can't go off and do these cool stuff. So for me, there's a lot of travelling back in time to sort of historical places, and I really didn't want to have any sort of homophobic attacks. I wanted it to be a happy story, and I didn't care if that wasn't historically accurate. I wanted to write that because I'd never read it. So yeah, I think there's a place for accuracy, but I think there should also be places for teenagers to read about people like themselves and not always feel like they've got to brace themselves for the attack that's inevitable, that they deserve to have happy stories too.
And the time and place thing is such an important point, because there is a time and a place for the kind of dark, terrifying, realistic in some context sort of storyline. However, there is like a tactfulness as well, because right now in the United States, like we're just a trash fire right now, particularly for POC, queer folks, trans folks, everybody basically. And to put out narratives that are negative or violent or dark when we're already being buried under like so much negativity, don't need it, don't want it. We want the positivity. But then in the same vein, like when gay marriage was passed and we were so happy, and there was too much happy, take that with a grain of salt, but there was so much happy that people stopped fighting. They thought that was that was it. That's all we need. Everything's fine. Meanwhile, kids are still being electrocuted to turn them straight in Utah. And like, we needed those narratives coming out to remind us to keep fighting. But now we're all so tired and like so desperately hopeless and sad that anything uplifting now is the time. So like time and place is absolutely it.
And also I feel like my readers are as young as 12. I've had a girl come up to me with her mum, and she said she was like 13, and she said, I've just come out and this is the first book I've read with a lesbian character like me. And I'm always very aware that I've got those young readers who might not know about the historical context of a scene. They'll just see someone that's like them and they're being mistreated, and I don't want to do that to someone. So yeah.
In my research, because we all know like art imitates life imitates art, it's that big cyclical thing. But in my research that I found is the stories that we put out have the power and potential to change society. So if we put out things that are happy and uplifting, or with a message that can be used for like social change, then that is what we should do if we want to see that change in society. So like the stories regarding coming out that are violent and horrific, I mean, people who are reading that we already know that happens. That's like a big reason of why people stay closeted. It's because we're so frightened of that. It's not something that we don't know. It's not something that's not already perpetuated. And therefore, like that, because of that, the stigma around coming out hasn't changed in a long time. The more positive messages we're getting, the younger people are coming out. The statistics show that queer people are getting younger and younger, but they've always been. They just haven't had the capacity to come out in a safe environment because the stories surrounding it, the information they're getting from the world, from our media, has been telling them that it's going to be horrific and violent, and they have to prepare themselves for that, rather than saying, like, this is who you are, and if you feel safe, you can. And there will always be somewhere, a community, someone that you can reach out to, or who will reach out to you, who will make you feel safe and do everything in their power to make sure that you're looked after. Like, I think, just like from, like, that's based on my research. Like, that's what it says, is that the more positive the stories, the more positive, like, the change on society is. Oh yeah, so like when you get people who ask you about like coming out, and if you say it was positive, they're like, oh, and then they're disappointed because it's not what they're used to. They're like, that can't be true. But like, it can be. It's not always the case, unfortunately, but like, to then have something to fall back on that is positive. That shows that your experience was horrible and other people's experiences have been really nice. But like, the future is bright no matter how it went, you know? I think that's something that's really, really important in our community, is to be able to sort of instill hope for the good fight, if that makes sense.
I suppose that kind of brings me on to a point I wanted to make. So, in anyone seen Orange is the New Black? Cool. So there's a death of a queer woman of colour in that show, and it was done that was very closely linked to the Black Lives Matter movement, in the way it happened, in the words used. And I think it really brought up the question of who was that for? Did like black people in America need to see it that explicitly? They already know. They already care. Did it have to take a fictional fave to die for white people to start to give a shit about that movement? Do you know what I mean? So I guess my question is, you know, how do we balance we're writing this stuff for queer teens, but they might be a minority of the audience? How do we make sure that it's... Do we think about straight audiences as well where we're writing, or where we're thinking about representation? How do we think those are mutually exclusive in any way? Or should it just be actually make the thing for queer teens and straight people can just like deal with the thing?
Well, yeah, it's their turn to deal with it. But I also think, so like the way that you can deal with some stuff is with sensitivity. So if you're writing something and you want it to be for a mass audience, no matter who they are, is to think, how can this impact the most vulnerable who are reading this? So like in Orange is the New Black, the biggest issue was like, yes, it related a lot to the Black Lives Matter, but the narrative surrounding it made the audience feel sympathy for the white guy who killed her. Like, and if they had picked the character who had been the villain from the start to do it, it would have maybe had a different outcome. So I think when you're writing these stories is to think, how will this affect the most vulnerable of my audience? Like, write it for everyone, write it for yourself, but then think, is what I'm saying here going to damage the most vulnerable? And that's something that's always got to be taken into account, in my opinion.
Has anyone seen Bohemian Rhapsody? Yeah. What did you think of the queer representation in that? Because I found it very interesting, because it felt like it was written for straight people, in that his queerness was never a positive thing, and they pushed it so that he only found like happiness right at the very end of the film in the last scene, and it was this big moment of, yes, he's finally going to be happy, but like then they skipped the next 10 years of his life where you never actually got to see him being happy. And I found it very that film took like, famous people, took like 10 years to get made, and I think I wonder a lot about whether that was why it took 10 years, because they were trying to find a way to tell the story of this very openly queer man in a way that was for a mainstream audience. I don't know if that's what everyone else feels. That's just personally what this topic made me think about it. Yeah.
I thought the most important part about that, yes, it was handled very well, but he said the words, I think I am bisexual.
And she went, no, you're gay.
That was the most important part, that he said, I think I'm bisexual. Nobody else said it. He said it.
Anyone else got thoughts on that? Sweet. We're going to do... we've talked a lot about the idea of, you know, the importance of relatability of stories for queer teens, and I think a lot of times the way we think about that is, oh, it will be a contemporary thing where they can literally see themselves, maybe a high school thing. Lauren, want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned it, you kind of teased us with that a little bit, the idea of like using these different genres, doing sci-fi, in your case, or like fantasy or historical stuff or detective novels, you know, things that are a little bit different to the literal, I can see myself in this because it's a high school narrative. Talk a little bit about that and how that can still be something that's valuable and like interesting.
So I write science fiction, and I really try to include LGBT characters in all those kind of books, because you never really see them in those genres, especially when it's not related to the story at all. And I'm a massive fan of Becky Chambers, who writes queer science fiction with non-binary pronouns. And they're these amazing literary fiction books. One was nominated for Lee's Book Prize. And she's one of the only people that are really doing that in a way that's really visible. And so I want to contribute to that. And all of my books are not about sexuality at all. So my next book out in the spring is about the last boy and girl born after humanity stopped being able to conceive. So they're going to grow up and watch the human race go extinct. And the female protagonist, Larry, is bisexual. And it's not at all what the book's about. I just wanted to write specifically about a bisexual character in a relationship with a man, because I feel like that's not often seen. You see them, women saying they're bisexual and then ending up with a woman, and I think that that raises like a massive part of the population. So I specifically wanted to write about that, but in a book that's not about that, because I personally want to read stories where things happen, and there's lots of complicated plots, and I think that science fiction as well, it represents the world we live in, and that's, if you go and look back at sort of genre fiction going back to the 20s, it really represents the world they were in. And we're seeing a lot of the rise of dystopias recently, which I think says a lot about our world. But also I think that science fiction is where you can sort of ask questions like, what would it look like if our society, everyone was in polyamorous relationships, or everybody was female? And those are two books that are coming out. There's one called The Cerulean by Amy Ewing, which is about that, and A Conspiracy of Truths by Alexandra Rowland. Both of those things are addressed. And it's a place where you can do that and actually answer the question in a very thoughtful way. So that's why I really like genre fiction specifically, because it just feels like there's so many more opportunities to really talk about stuff.
Anyone got any other thoughts on, genres, other sort of things that they would love to see queer teens in? Go for it.
I keep talking a lot, I'm sorry. Yeah, have any of you read Six of Crows or Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo? It's it's so good, right? I love her to bits. But basically it's a very weird genre. How would you describe it?
It's like a fantasy heist.
Fantasy heist, but with like contemporary feel.
Yeah.
It's amazing. But like, it's like in films where they make their hero really bland so that you can then see yourself doing those things. That's the whole point, that like they have Keanu Reeves and things like that in action films. It's so that you can project yourself onto someone with no personality. And I think it's not as the same in books, because a lot of our main characters are really like complex. But I think it's sort of the same when you put yourself in the same situation as the characters. And if you can see someone who reflects you, even if it's in space, or if you're doing a heist for 10 million Cruise or whatever, like it's all about being able to like see yourself having a life or an adventure, which is why I'm so excited about these books. But like in Six of Crows, there's no coming out for some of the queer characters. Like there's just a thing, and the only way that they come out to the audience is through like really well-placed gay jokes and obviously a relationship, but like to give you the wink, wink, nudge, nudge before it happens. And I'm like, that's so true to real life. Like I don't sit down and go, I'm gay. I make a joke and everyone's like, what did you just say? Does that mean? And I'm like, mm-hmm. So like, I think that it's not about seeing yourself reflected exactly in a character. It's more about being like, seeing characters who could be like you in any genre, in any place, and then being like, I could be that character one day. I could be on an adventure, or like, these people are like me and they're still being able to do stuff. So that means I can go do stuff. Like I'm going to go climb something. And I just think that's like it's a really powerful tool of media, is to be able to make people like get transported. And it's so nice when there's a diverse cast that you can like see yourself doing the same things because they're in some way like you, and that's really important.
So something, and I don't know if this will translate very well, so we've talked a lot about queer characters and queer individuals within greater contexts, and what I'd like to see, and which I haven't actually seen, and if anybody knows, but how do I say, it's like a queer culture and like the culture built around those individuals, because some of us live in the gayborhood and it has a very specific flavor, and like if you think about Paris is Burning, like the drag scene and that culture built around individuals, and translating that into a Western or into sci-fi, and like bringing that culture with you, aside from just being queer individual in sci-fi, where's the gayborhood? Like where is the culture that translates to that? And I haven't seen that yet, unless it's in like The Birdcage or Paris is Burning, or I don't know, other shows or whatever built around a queer culture. Killjoys? I feel like I'm just writing down.
Yeah, I'm
everything
literally.
that I've
Yeah.
said.
No. Is that the
So what
Marvel
is it?
one?
No. It's
Oh, nice.
But
Some
they
sci-fi.
do have some very representation.
I do think that's an interesting point, though, the idea of like it almost feels like a lot of the stuff we've been saying could almost, we improve the one thing in each of them. So it's like, I guess one should have queer friendship, and I guess one should be about the gayborhood, and I guess one could be sci-fi, and I'm like, what if all of the things? Like, what the hell would that look like? Let's make it
Anyone
happen.
doing NaNoWriMo, get started.
Don't call me, I haven't started writing yet, and it's like so far into the month. Well,
Because she loves science fiction and to see herself reflected in science fiction.
Well, Lauren's books are available to purchase.
Yes,
Please
I have
come
some.
after the panel.
So if you want your books reviewed,
Anyone else got thoughts? I guess like the last question before we throw to the audience questions would be, does anyone else have sort of stuff that you want to see in the future for the representation of teens? Anything in particular? Anything you're looking forward to that is coming out, etc., etc.?
Lots more stuff about the internet and fandom, and how queer teenagers and straight teenagers use fandom as a safe place to explore their sexuality online. That's something I explored a bit in The Loneliest Girl in the Universe. It's about a girl on a spaceship who uses fan fiction to like explore herself because she has nobody to talk to. And that's something that I found a lot growing up, was that the internet was like really where you can like see what people are up to and like explore yourself and not feel like anyone's watching you. And I think there's nowhere near enough books about the internet, so anything more about that, I want to know about it and read it.
I think I want to see more books and films and anything about like lesser recognised sexualities and genders. So books about like asexuality or being non-binary. I feel like YA fiction is like just starting to kind of tackle these things, but it's only like just beginning. So hopefully over the next few years we'll see more and more stories about less represented identities.
Wouldn't that be nice?
I love a happy ending. I think more diverse coming out stories as well. If we're going to stick to coming out stories, because we've said that they are important, like a lot of the mainstream coming out stories are sort of like white men coming out to Christian families mostly. I want to see something about a bisexual, non-binary person coming out to their Muslim Arab family, or like maybe like to different friends with different backgrounds as well, and how that would, what the distinction is there, or if there even is any. So yeah, like more diverse coming out stories, happy endings, and let's please get rid of the forced coming out trope. That's my take on today.
I think it's interesting because when you're talking about coming out stories that haven't necessarily happened before, haven't been seen, the difficulty is when there's only, it's like, this is the one Muslim coming out story, bisexual Muslim coming out story. It's like, well, that somehow has to represent the entirety of every bisexual Muslim who's come out. And then and I think that we get this with kind of LGBT stuff, where everything else is kind of like male, white, cis. You still have the idea of, okay, what if this coming out goes this way, then what are you trying to say about this? And so the more intersectionality you add onto it, the more it becomes are you trying to say that all Muslims are homophobic? Are you trying to say that Muslims can't be homophobic? Are you trying to, and I think that what we need is like much more of the things. We need like not just one of those things, but like many of those things, so that they have the ability to explore themselves and to be what they're going to be without trying to have to show everyone's stories. And the more people you include, and the more narratives we have with multiple queer people in the same place, the more that allows those different experiences to come out. So we're going to throw it open to the audience. Hands up, and I will grab people for questions if you have any. Yes, at the back.
Oh, yeah, it's probably a fact, but,
Also acceptable.
Yeah.
No.
It's really interesting talking about coming out stories. It's basically a small town and everyone's gay, basically. It's, gay is the norm.
I want to move there.
But, being is shunned and it's not acceptable. And you've got, the lead, actress is, I think, Brianna again. You've got, she's the quarterback, and then she falls in love with a guy. And it's obviously it's switched it all up and it's flipped it, and it's such an interesting watch. It's heartbreaking, and it's really, really powerful, but it's a completely different way to, show people how coming out is really difficult, and it's, especially for the straight community, it's definitely worth a watch.
There's also a musical called Xana Don't that has a very similar premise, but also music. And it's the campest thing you ever watch. It's beautiful. Rebecca has a question.
Hello, we were talking about this earlier, but I was wondering what people think of all the metaphorical coming out stories that appear, especially in genres where there are no actual queer people, and how those stories, if you see examples that do work well, if you think that there is a way to use the coming out as a metaphor, but not have it end up being very erasing of actual queer experience.
Excellent question. Thoughts, panel?
Also, I know Rowan has thoughts.
I do, but I don't want to jump in before the panel has, so I'm like, chill, guys.
Can you give us an example of what you were talking about, specifically?
A lot of when someone is secretly a superhero, and then it's they sit down. Or a lot of those are sort of different, usually kind of.
You can say X-Men. You can say the exact film. That's an actual scene from an X-Men film.
I feel it comes up more literally or subtly across a lot of different genres. No one can know my secret. It's a superpower, whatever.
I think just have them be gay as well, and they can still come out, but it'd be about not being queer. I mean, yeah.
Who uses metaphors these days? Just say it, you cowards.
Gay people use metaphors too.
Are metaphors gay? The next panel. I tweeted a little while ago, and it's I'm not bitter or anything. It's blown up on Tumblr because someone screenshotted it, and it's got 50,000 notes. It does not have 50,000 retweets. Basically, the classic ending of a teen movie, of a gay teen movie, where you have the voiceover at the end, and it's someone being so in the end, I guess we all came out. Becky came out as a maths geek, Aaron came out as a painter, and I came out as me. And then it's boom, boom, pop punk. Because it is this idea of the coming out narrative, and people, it's so overused by other kind of elements that there's kind of a meaninglessness when you don't have that rep. A good version of that is in The Flesh, which is it's real sad, but there is a whole storyline around being it's about zombies. It's post-zombie apocalypse where people have risen from the dead, and it's about people, whether or not you should assimilate and pretend to be alive. So you have the government gives you the NHS, because it's set in the UK, gives you makeup to try and cover your skin and contact lenses so you look like you're a living person, and it's whether or not you kind of come out as this thing which has been shunned by not putting on this facade. But then it also has many queer characters in it, so it's okay, we can do both of these things at the same time.
Yeah. I think I would be a Tyrannosaurus Rex because I have very small arms. I know it already.
Stegosaurus is obviously the most adorable of all the dinosaurs.
But yes, going back on that, I think metaphors. I did like that question. I'm going to talk to you about it afterwards in detail why. But I think going back to that as well is when you use metaphors, you have to be very careful, because there is a lot. For example, in The Flesh, I grew up in a rural community like that, and I could have seen it as a commentary on race and racism in a community, and having to assimilate to your farmer white man aesthetic and speak and views. To protect yourself and your family kind of thing, which is, so I think with metaphors, any kind of marginalized person can maybe like take what they see from it, whereas if it's explicit, it stops being so like vague and open to interpretation. And I think that's really important if you want to have something that's going to be really meaningful. But it's also like nice to have something that lots of different people go, well, I interpreted it this way, and have a dialogue on that. But if you are trying to say something by saying something else, you have to be prepared for people to see lots of different things and not feel represented in it, actually, if that makes sense. So that's that.
I think we can do
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. In which case, we'll take another question.
Yeah. Coming out narratives where people know before you do. I think there's potential comedy there. Where everyone is dropping you hints that you just don't get.
You mean my personal life?
Yeah.
That's literally how it happened.
Do you have examples of that you've like?
Should I say my story?
Tell the story.
My English teacher, when I was 16, definitely knew before I did and was dropping me hints about me. She would recommend me only gritty lesbian novels, and she gave me Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and she went, you need this. And I was there, and I took it, and I was like, oh, will this help my coursework, miss? Thanks. And I read it, and I was like, oh, what's this? And then I kept it under my pillow for 6 months and didn't talk about it in any of my essays. But it's like, and then she would, she kept doing that to me. She kept giving me lots of like gay and queer literature to read, and was like, so what did you think? And I'd be like, I think when the author said this is what they meant. And she'd be like, and like, a couple of years later, I'm like, oh wow, she knew. Fingersmith, Tipping the Velvet, Sarah Waters, she was like,
yes.
you should just read these and tell me what you take from it. And I was like, history's gay? I don't know. So yeah, like that was really nice, because at the time when I was coming to terms with it at that point, but I didn't understand that other people could tell. And it was nice because when I kind of fully like realized, and I was looking back and I was like, my teacher is so supportive, and I know that the people after me will have like someone to go talk to if like they pick up on the hints, which I didn't because I'm very stupid. But like, I think, yeah, that would be quite nice, but it's also like you have to tread the line, because it can be quite scary as well if the wrong person realizes, which is what I was going to before with Love, Simon and stuff. But yeah, that's my little story. I just realized I was gay from reading Fingersmith, which is amazing.
Same.
Anyone got one last question that we can take? Yes. Do you know what? This is the last one. Going down the panel. Stegosaurus, because just cute and round and like clumpy and like adorable and spiky back. What's not to love? T-Rex.
Allosaurus. So an Allosaurus, yeah, right, is like slightly more adaptable than a raptor. And I work in events for my day job, and I just threw a dinosaur party. And like the Allosaurus was my favorite. It was so exciting. So Allosaurus is special.
A velociraptor. I think that would be pretty cool.
Are they called, is it a diplodocus that's like giraffe shaped? I like those.
And on that note, thank you very much for coming to the panel. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. And yeah, if you would like to talk to any of these people about these incredible books they have up here or anything, we'll be sat here for a little bit, so feel free to come as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the amazing questions.